of the most important areas to have your grounding, at least in today's culture, is on the arguments for the existence of God. And so that is going to be our topic for this evening. I'll begin with an objection, a common one. A person will say, human cultures have historically believed in thousands of gods, and you reject all of those. The only difference between you and me is I believe in one less God than you. This was said to me by a friend of mine in high school. Throughout high school, he was a very ardent Christian, and it was a dream of his to become a missionary, in fact, and he was hoping he would be able to go to Muslim lands and die for the gospel. He didn't. He went to college instead, and he read a couple of the wrong books, and then he said this to me in senior year of college, and so I was stunned to find that this kid had become an atheist. This is a line which isn't original to him. It's kind of a clever, maybe too clever atheist trope. But here's how it works. It sets up God, the true God, among the list of other supposed deities worshipped by pagan cultures. Thor, Zeus, Ra, Vishnu, all these others. And it makes it seem as if we're kind of picking one arbitrarily, just blind to the fact that others have believed in other gods. And so, like, as if we're believing in, as if ours is just as absurd as anyone else's, and the idea that ours is the correct one and all those other ones is wrong is just arbitrary and foolish and clueless. And so one comic I saw just a couple days ago was two kids walking down a road, and then one says to the other, "What's it like to not believe in God?" And the other kid says, "Well, do you believe in Zeus?" The other kid says, "No." And the first kid says, "It's kind of like that." But the problem is, it's not at all like that. That invites the question of, what do we mean by the word God? And that's the first thing we have to think about when we're arguing for the existence of God, is what do we even mean by the word God? Because if you look at the Greek deities, or even the Egyptian deities, or the Celtic deities, or any of the others, what you're looking really at are fussy, immoral superheroes. They have origins in time, they have mothers, they have fathers, they come into existence, they had innate physical forms, and they also had limitations in both their powers and their scope. And so when a person says to you, "I don't believe in any gods," they're usually imagining the fussy, immoral, pagan superheroes. What they don't understand is what we mean by the word God, which is much closer to what ancient Greek philosophers understood by the word God. And I like to start here because it's not as if we Christians came up with this concept and we're just saying, "Oh, ours is so different." No, this is actually something that philosophers in Greece independently came to. If you look at the history of Greek thought, one finds that there are inklings of monotheism found in Greek logic. So I have a listing here of some of the some Greek philosophers who arrived at something like God with their philosophies. Most notably, Heraclitus, who was a late Stoic, who called the great ordering principle of the universe the Logos, and then of course there's Plato and Aristotle, who had the prime mover, the unmoved mover, which holds up all of reality. And so they recognized that the deities that were worshipped by their culture were unworthy of the name, that the real God, the real true God, had to be the one subsistent act of being which upholds the whole universe. That's what's worthy of the name, and that's what we're talking about when we say God. One person who was aware of this was St. Paul again, who in Acts chapter 17, when he goes to Greece, he quotes Greek philosophers, and he says, "From one ancestor, he," as in God, "made all nations to inhabit the whole earth. So they would not search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said." And so St. Paul, being aware of Greek philosophy, knew that even among the Greek tradition, there was this inkling that there was something greater than the little fussy deities they worshipped, that there was something which upholds all of reality. And again, St. John borrows from the Greeks when he opens up the beginning of his gospel in John chapter 1, where he says, in the beginning there was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And so this is something that even the gospel writers were aware of, was that even in Hellenized Greek, there were inklings of the gospel waiting to flower. And so what we mean by God is the one all-powerful, transcendent creator of the universe who imbues it with intelligibility and is the very act of existence itself. And I would say that if this deity was to introduce himself to someone, it would sound a bit like, I am who am. Now, how do we know that God exists? I once asked this question at a youth ministry night, and I said to Audrey, her name was Audrey, she's since become a religious sister. I said to her, Audrey, how do you know that God exists? And she began to rattle off an argument, a very complex argument for the existence of God. She was like, well, she got this big smile on her face. She was very proud of herself. And she got about a sentence into it, and I was like, Audrey, stop. Did you believe in God when you were 7? She's like, yes. Did you know that argument when you were 7? No. It's like, Audrey, why do you believe in God? Right? Because most of us don't believe in God on the basis of confirming arguments. We have what Alvin Plantinga, a Calvinist philosopher who works at, who either teaches or taught at Notre Dame. I can't remember if he's retired or not. But he had this understanding of human knowledge where he talks about properly basic knowledge. Properly basic knowledge is those things which you're just rational to hold even if you can't argue for them. Things like your own existence, the reality of the past, the existence of other human minds, the existence of the real world of your senses, that you're actually in a real world that you're inhabiting, in the laws of cause and effect. Just things that if someone asked you to prove any of these things, you wouldn't be able to do it, but at the same time, they're crazy for denying it. So he calls these properly basic knowledge. And among those, he posits that God is part of our properly basic knowledge, that you can know that God exists without ever having to justify it to other people. You can just intuit it. And I love the quote by St. Josephine Bakhita, who, before she was a Christian, before she met missionaries, when she was just an uneducated slave living in Uganda, she later reflected back on her experiences in that state of affairs, and she said, seeing the sun, the moon, and the stars, I said to myself, who could be the master of these beautiful things? And I felt a great desire to see him and to know him and to pay him homage. And I think that that is more like how most of us know the existence of God, is that we just intuit it by the world around us. And it's nothing so rational that we could, directly prove it to other people based on our reasons, but it's just something that we know. And yet, it helps to be able to show that God exists. It helps. Because there are times when that natural knowledge, either because of ignorance or maybe tragedy, it becomes rather foggy. And the arguments for the existence of God can help us find our way home. And of course, if confronted by a person who doesn't believe in God, it can help them find their way home. St. Paul in Romans chapter 1 said that God has left enough in nature that we could rationally understand and prove his existence. He said, for what can be known about God is plain to them, namely the pagans, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. The same is also said in the Book of Wisdom. Reflecting on that, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, created in God's image and called to know and love him, the person who seeks God discovers him through certain ways of coming to know him. These are also called proofs for the existence of God, not in the sense of proofs of the natural sciences, but rather in the sense of converging and convincing arguments which allow us to attain certainty about the truth. The way that formal arguments work is you have different premises, and these premises kind of combine together using the rules of logic and lead to a conclusion. Back when I took the I-STEP test, the one that they always used for us was Johnny is on the chair is in the kitchen, therefore Johnny is in the kitchen. That is a very simple, straightforward, 2 premises, 1 conclusion. If the first 2 are true, the conclusion follows necessarily. There is your argument. And so the goal of any sort of argument, at least put forward in this sort of official, dressed up way, is to defend the premises and then show that the conclusion follows. And when I say defend the premises, I'm not saying you have to prove it to absolute 100% metaphysical certainty. Sometimes that's set as the standard before you. A person can say, but you only know that with 99.5% accuracy, therefore I'm justified in doubting it. It doesn't really work like that. In order to show that a premise or an argument is good, you just have to show that the premises are more likely to be true than false, that you are justified in believing them. Very few things in life do you know with absolute 100% certainty. Maybe almost nothing, except for maybe your own existence, do you know with 100% certainty. So the point is not to try to clear that impossible bar of 100% certainty, but rather just to show that these things have good reasons behind them and they're more likely to be true, and therefore you're rational to believe them. And the other people would be more rational to believe them too. So let's, now with all those preparatory remarks, let's get into our first argument. This one is called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The word Kalam is references an Islamic school of thought. They were the ones who have done the most work on this in history. And cosmological refers to, that means cosmos, refers to the universe. And in Catholic circles, this was favored by St. Bonaventure, but St. Thomas Aquinas hated this argument, just hated it. Thomas Aquinas was actually, he was a pretty cool as a cucumber type fella. The only time you'll actually see him get angry in writing is in denouncing people who put forward this argument. And so he basically killed this argument in Catholic circles for about 500 years before Protestants got a hold of this argument and said, hey, this looks pretty good. And so this was actually repopularized by Protestants. And then kind of Catholics took another look at it and said, maybe this is worth another thought. And I've seen Thomas Aquinas' objections to it, and honest to God, I can't get it. I don't know what I don't understand what his problem was with it. Thomas Aquinas, please forgive me. We're going to do this despite his objections. St. Bonaventure, pray for us. Okay, so premise one is basically just the law of cause and effect. But it's important to phrase it just right. Things which have a beginning, or things which begin to exist, have a cause, or have a cause that began them. And this is just drawn from your experience. Things that happen have a cause. Events that happen have a cause. You began to exist. You have a cause, namely your parents. I have a couple examples here. A car. What's the cause of the car? The factory. What's the cause of the little chicken? The big chicken. So that's just drawn from your understanding of how the world works. You see stuff happen, you see stuff beginning to exist, and you intuit that there has to be some sort of cause behind it. The second premise is that the universe began to exist. And when we say the universe, we're talking about all time, space, matter, and energy, the entire physical world under any description. And this is known in two ways. It can be known from philosophy, and there's also evidence from modern physics. So first we'll do the philosophy one, and this is where St. Thomas Aquinas got off the boat, but too bad. The chief philosophical argument that's put forward to this is called the impossibility of traversing the infinite. And here's how that little mind experiment works, and it helps to draw an analogy. Imagine you approached a bottomless pit. So here's our guy next to a sign that says warning, bottomless pit. Absolutely no bottom to the thing. Well, how many golf balls would it take to fill up an infinitely deep hole? And the answer is an infinite amount of golf balls. And so if you were to drop in golf balls one at a time, would you ever get to the top of that hole? What if you got like dump trucks and you're just... Would you ever fill up the infinitely deep hole? And the answer is no. You could never reach the top of that hole by adding up discrete golf balls. Well, that's compared to the timeline. So imagine the past is infinitely long. All right, so there is t equals negative infinity back there. And so you imagine imagine like an elementary particle, like a quark, which has always existed. All right? How long would it have to exist to get till now? And the answer is it would have to be infinite years old. So how is that even possible? Because that would require an infinitely long period of time to have to be traversed before we get to now. To put it another way, say there was a young Irish man in high school, and he asked a girl out on a date. And she said to him, "Yes, I am happy to go on the date with you, but first I want you to count to infinity. And when you're done with that, I will gladly go on the date with you." Is he ever going on that date? No, he is not going on that date, because it is impossible to reach infinity using discrete events. And so if the past is infinitely long, what that would mean is that an infinite amount of events have preceded now, which is just logically impossible. You would never reach anywhere on that timeline if you have to start from negative infinity. And that was what would be entailed if the world has been around infinitely long. It's just a brain teaser. You can't figure out how that's even possible. And that's one way from philosophy that you can know that that time has to have a beginning. So say you found that guy on the date, and she says, he counted to infinity, not sure how he did it. Well, you know that he cheated somehow, and God bless him for doing it. So that's one way of understanding, just from a thought experiment, that we would have to have a finite past. Then we go into the more scientific understandings of why there has to be a finite past. And one would be the second law of thermodynamics. There's all kinds of different descriptions of the thing, but I think the simplest one is that this is the principle that thermal energy disperses from high concentrations to low. So it's why you pour yourself a nice hot bath, and then you go downstairs to get something, and then you forget about the bath, and you come back an hour later, and your hot bath is now a very uncomfortable cold bath, because the concentration of heat in the bath has escaped into the air and has escaped into the rest of the house, and everything has reached equilibrium. So the second law of thermodynamics is it drives a lot, or practically every single thermal energy transfer there is. Now the implications for this on the universe as a whole is that if the universe was infinitely old, we would have already reached a state of complete thermal distribution known as the heat death of the universe. So no more stars, no more heat concentrations anywhere. Just no more chemistry happening, because everything has basically fizzled out. That's called the heat death of the universe. If the universe was already infinite years old, we already would have reached this point where nothing's happening anymore. Again, every star would have collapsed into nothingness. All chemical reactions would have ceased. Everything would have broken down. There would be nothing but inert, cold dust everywhere. And that would be what would happen if the universe was infinite years old. And the fact that it isn't means that it had to have had a beginning. And then the last way of knowing this from science is basically just modern cosmology. Proposes that the universe is about 13.7 billion years old, and the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And this is something that we've known for a while that's called the Standard Model Big Bang cosmology. And the one cautionary note I have to put on this particular slide is that science is always tentative. We could find out 30 years from now some incredible new discovery that makes this number out of date. It used to be that scientists believed that in a steady state universe that had infinite age, and now of course they believe in a universe that has a beginning. Science is always tentative. For the time being, science, the best science we have, points to the universe having a beginning, and it doesn't seem like that's going to change. But whereas philosophy is your friend forever, science is your friend for the time being. I don't want to say that it's all wibbly wobbly and up in the air, but it's just important to know that there could conceivably be a day where science stops being your friend. But for the time being, and for the last 80 years or so, science has been our friend on this point. And so the conclusion, following from premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause, and premise 2, the universe began to exist, is that the universe has a cause. Now that seems like a rather, mundane observation. So the next part is really to think it through. what would it mean for something to be the cause of all time, space, matter, and energy? And so some simple conclusions would be that the thing would have to be immaterial because it created all matter. So it can't be another material thing. It has to be an immaterial thing. It created all time. So it has, and time doesn't exist without matter. So it has to be a timeless thing. It has to be very, very powerful because it created a whole universe. And then, the last one here in the green, deliberative, that's a bit longer of an argument to get out. But because this thing is timeless and created something so unlike itself, one can conclude that it had to be deliberative. It had to basically decide to create something so different from itself. Now, there's complicated reasoning to try to show that, but we don't have time for that tonight. But those are sort of the four conclusions you can draw from the Kalam cosmological argument, is that you're looking for, that you have argued, you have used reason to point you to the existence of an immaterial, timeless, very powerful, deliberative creator of the universe. Now let's talk about a common objection called the God of the Gaps objection. And it goes like this. You're just looking at an unknown and leaping to the conclusion that it's your God. I'm comfortable looking at the origins of the universe and saying, I don't know, and someday we may know more. This is called the God of the Gaps objection. It's best phrased by Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astronomer, who said, if you don't understand something and the community of physicists don't understand it, that means God did it? If that's how you invoke the evidence for your creator, of God, then God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance that's getting smaller as time moves on. So, a God of the Gaps argument is a bad argument. And that would sound something like this. I don't know what caused the tsunami, therefore, there is God. That's a God of the Gaps argument. I don't know what caused the tsunami, therefore, for lack of any understanding of what caused the tsunami, I'm just going to say God did it, therefore God. That's a God of the Gaps argument. That's not what we're doing with the Kalam cosmological argument. Again, a God of the Gaps argument moves basically directly from something you don't understand to therefore God with nothing in between. But what the Kalam is doing, it's taking something you do understand, which is how cause and effect works, and that the universe began to exist, and then you're just reasoning through what that would take, and then you come to something which has to have certain divine attributes. At no point did you make a sort of leap over the unknown to an unwarranted conclusion. So a person who levels that argument at the Kalam or any of the other arguments for the existence of God that are used apologetically these days is really barking up the wrong tree. The second objection is to say, well, if everything has a cause, then what caused God? Aha! Every first-year philosophy student thinks he's really, really smart when he trots that out. But that's why it's important, I said, to phrase the first premise properly. Everything which has a beginning has a cause. It's not everything has a cause, it's everything that begins to exist has a cause. Because the thing that we're actually trying to point to is the idea that there has to be something that doesn't have a beginning. And so when a person says, you said everything has a cause, well, what about God? That's called a straw man argument. That's not what you said. They're just attacking a thing you didn't say. Okay, so now let's move on to the second argument we're going to do tonight, called the Contingency Argument. Now, this is one where St. Thomas Aquinas gets on board with the train again. He's like, okay, we'll kiss and make up. This is very similar to, I think it's St. Thomas Aquinas' third way. But I've kind of formulated it the way that makes sense to me. So, this one is basically all philosophy. If the previous one brought in some science, this one's basically all philosophy. And so premise one is everything that exists has some explanation for its existence, either by some external cause or through its own necessity. This is called the principle of sufficient reason. And basically it just means that there aren't things that exist for no reason whatsoever. I could point to anything at all, and there's some reason that it exists. There's nothing that just exists for no reason whatsoever. As human beings, we're always looking for the causes of things, for the reasons of things. And if there was, a basketball just sitting right there, and you said, Stephen Weiss, there's a basketball there, I wouldn't just say to you, for absolutely no reason at all whatsoever. It is there on the floor without any cause, without any explanation. It is just there. You would look at me like I'm a bit odd. All right, so say you blew up the basketball to the size of the Earth, and you ask the same question, Stephen, why is that basketball the size of the Earth there? It didn't get any less, it doesn't demand less of an explanation just by being larger. That's what the principle of sufficient reason is basically anything at all has some reason why it exists. Now let's do a quick aside on some definitions, because I'm going to use some terminology here. The word contingent means that it's something which could have not existed, or it could have been different, or it depends on something for its existence. The word contingent, when we use it in modern parlance, we might say the soccer game will happen contingent upon the weather. We're saying it's depending on the weather. Well, in philosophy, the word contingent means anything that could have failed to exist, anything which could have not existed. I could have not existed. If my parents had waited one more night, I would not exist. So anything which could have failed to exist or been different than what it is called contingent. Something necessary is something which must exist and contains its own reason for its own existence. You might say to yourself, well, what would that be? And some people would say that mathematics. Some people would say that mathematics is necessary. Like 2 + 2 = 4 is just a necessary truth. It has there's no possible universe in which 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, even if people say that it's absurd or worse. So, anyways, the first premise is the principle of sufficient reason. When you see things in the world, it is always meaningful to ask, what is it? Where did it come from? What's its reason for being? And without this principle, there would be no scientific inquiry. Imagine if we looked at like an atom or something and we said, well, what's the reason for the atom? What's the thing that explains the atom? And we just said, nothing at all. There's no explanation for the atom. Right? Well, science would just come to a dead stop. The nature of scientific inquiry is that you look for reasons for things and you explore more. Okay, premise 2. An infinite series of contingent causes doesn't fully explain something. This would be called an infinite regress of causes. And to illustrate that, I love to recite this fanciful story I heard. It goes like this. There's a story of a woman who thought the earth sat on the back of a turtle. A philosopher asked her, what does the turtle stand on? And she replied defiantly, it's turtles, all the way down. And of course, your mind says, down to what? Right? What she proposed is that there's just an infinite stack of turtles explaining why the world exists. And you're like, well, there has to be a turtle standing on something, right? Because even if the line of turtles is infinite in length, you still haven't explained why the world is where it is. On your handout, I think I have a picture of a hook holding up a lamp, right? And that's another analogy you can use is like, if you're asking, why is this lamp hanging in the air? You can say, well, it's that link holding up the lamp. Okay, well, what's holding up that link? Well, it's that link. Well, what's holding up that link? It's that one. Well, eventually, even if that link is like a million chains long, you need to come to something that's hooked in before you have actually explained why the thing is standing in the air. And so the second premise, again, is even an infinite series of contingent causes doesn't explain the thing, because you can always then ask, well, what about that contingent cause? What about that one? What about that one? What about that one? Eventually, you have to realize that you're not going to explain the thing just by appealing to another contingent thing. Which leads us to our third premise. Contingent things exist. There is a contingent thing. It is an aardvark. It is one of my favorite of contingent things. I happen to like aardvarks. Okay, that was it for premise 3. Aardvarks exist. That was it. All right. So we're gonna pause there and make a conclusion. All right, is that there must be a necessarily existing thing which grounds the explanations for everything else. Okay. So what we've talked about here is that everything that exists has some sort of reason for its existence, but those reasons can't stretch back infinitely, because even if they do, you haven't fully explained a thing. Therefore, if you're going to explain anything, there has to be some stopping point for the explanations. There has to be something which exists necessarily, something which is metaphysically unlike the contingent things, something which exists through the power of its own nature. What I like to call an explanatory ground floor. Okay, and then the last premise is the universe is contingent. And so the universe could have been different. It could have had one less atom in it. It could have been half the size that it is now. It could have been twice the size that it is now. It could have just not contained Earth. The universe could have been different. It could have also just not existed at all. And so the universe is a contingent thing. And so we reached conclusion number 2, which is this necessarily existing thing, which we propose exists, must transcend and explain even the universe. And so what does that give us? It tells us that there has to be a necessarily existing transcendent explanation of the universe. Now this, by the way, this Mario box here is our stand-in for God as we're feeling out the mysterious God that we're drawing outlines around. That's what the Mario box is representing for us. And so that's what the contingency argument gives you, is the idea of something which exists necessarily and that it contains its own explanation, that the reason why it exists is because it is existence itself. It contains its own explanation for its existence. All right, the next one, if that one was all philosophy, this one's basically all science. This is probably the newest one in the history of apologetics, and it's called the fine-tuning argument. And so let's do a little bit of a brief on the physical sciences. Science, as you know, has scientific laws, which are expressed by the means of mathematical equations. So I have up here is the equation for gravitational attraction, which is the force of gravitational attraction equals the gravitational constant times one mass times the second mass divided by the radius between the two squared. That's how things orbit one another. And all of science basically is described mathematically in this way. But in all the equations, you'll find popping up these things like the big letter G there. That's the gravitational constant. All right, so physics is suffused with these constants and these quantities that are just kind of set. They're just sort of baked into the fabric of the universe. It's like, why is the gravitational constant that? Well, it just is. That's basically all there is to say about it. That's the gravitational constant in the universe, the end. And there are other examples like the speed of light, the Planck constant, which is the shortest possible length that's conceivable, the mass of an electron, the charge of an electron. There's probably like a good 24 of these things. You can buy books on the subject of the constants in the laws of physics. All right, so that's a little brief on the way that mathematical physics works. The fine-tuning principle is an observation which is somewhat recent in the history of science, is that turns out a lot of these physical constants, if they had been anything different from what they are, even by like 0.0000001%, it would result in a universe which is incapable of supporting any form of life. Not like we would have 6 legs instead of 2, but any form of life. So for instance, the gravitational constant, if it was off by 1 in 10 to the 50th, the universe would either be a black hole or a cloud of dust. Any stronger, any weaker, basically everything would go, the Big Bang would go, and that would be the end. Everything would be a black hole. Or it would just go, and everything would be so far apart that there would be no chemistry, because basically you just have a scattered dust cloud of protons that never interact with one another. The electromagnetic constant, the strong force constant are another 2 examples of this, but the examples go on and on. And the conclusion is that our universe that we are in is fine-tuned for life to an impossibly accurate degree. Now, next we have to think about what are the possible causes of this extraordinary finding. And this is either due to chance, we got super lucky. Ain't we lucky that the universe is like this? Necessity, it had to be this way. There's something about physics that demands it be that way. Inevitability, which we'll explain in a moment, or design. Someone made it this way. All right, that's the second premise. Premise 3 is it's not due to chance, necessity, or inevitability. Now, chance is ruled straight out because the odds themselves are just impossible. No one takes it seriously. Necessity is also ruled straight out because there is no reason why those constants had to be what they are. Thus, we go to inevitability or design. And the inevitability one is what we call the multiverse. This is the big counter argument to fine-tuning. And it works like this. Think of how there are billions of planets in the universe. And imagine we said, look how fine-tuned our planet is for life. Amazing. Only God could have designed a planet so wonderful for life. And here we are on it. Look how lucky we are. To which a person would say, well, you know, there's like trillions of planets in the universe. Inevitably, one of them was going to be able to support life. And so, duh, the one that supports life has life on it. You know, you have the causal arrow in the wrong direction. It's not, you know, God decided to make a planet that had just the right conditions, then put us on it. It's that with trillions of planets, eventually one's going to be able to support life, and here we are, right? Take that principle and now apply it to the universe. And now a person says, well, really, our universe, our visible universe, is really one part of an even greater, unimaginably greater system of universes, such wise that they're like, each universe is like a grain of sea on the seashore. And that's called the multiverse hypothesis, and it proposes that for each one of these things, the constants and quantities that were built into physics are going to be randomly different from one another. And yeah, so eventually you're going to wind up with a universe which is going to be not dead. If you have trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions, I mean, actually, I could probably say trillions all night and still not grasp the odds of this. If you have enough, eventually you're going to stumble upon one where everything lands just right and you have a life-supporting universe. But there's a reason why that objection doesn't work. And here's why. Is because in order to get that, you have to have a universe-generating machine, basically, which can produce trillions of these things without breaking down. And it has to produce these things with all the fine-tuned variables have to be perfectly random. So how do you get that? Whatever mechanism is generating these universes itself would have to be finely tuned. And so this appeal to the multiverse doesn't eliminate your fine-tuning problem if you're trying to object to this argument. It just means you kicked it up one level to whatever the heck is generating all of these universes, because that itself would have to be a very specific thing in order to give us a life-sustaining universe. And so, with all of the other explanations kicked out, the conclusion is the universe was designed by a mind. And so what we get from that is a mind of unimaginable intelligence and the ability to create a whole universe. Now, I've already kind of covered this objection in the course of the explanation, but we're going to revisit it just to drive it home. A person could say, this argument is like saying is like a puddle of water looking at the ground and saying, how amazing is it that this gap in the road perfectly conforms to my shape? It gets the effect of the cause and effect relationship in reverse. So again, to look at this analogy, any particular shape or hole in the ground is enough to create a puddle. And the size of the puddle follows the shape of the hole, not vice versa. And so it would be foolish to say, what a coincidence that hole would be just the right shape for that water. And that would be foolishness. And so the idea is that if the variables had been different, then we would just have different forms of life. You know, you would have beings with green skin and 4 eyes instead of 2 eyes and tannish skin. But as I already mentioned, this argument, it doesn't propose that there would just be different life. No, the stakes involved are that there would be no life, period, whatsoever. There wouldn't be even chemistry. There would be no opportunity for even the most obscure forms of life to come about. And so just changing the variables doesn't give you a slightly different world. It gives you basically no world. And so this argument just is one which doesn't properly understand the stakes involved. The other objection to this, which is very common, is kind of like an observer bias objection. It says, well, we shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in a life-supporting universe. If it was any different, we wouldn't be here. So we shouldn't be surprised. But again, that one also doesn't fully understand the situation we're describing. Suppose you were facing a firing squad of 17 trained marksmen, and when given the command to fire, all of them miss. Okay? Well, a person could say, well, you're alive, but there's no reason to be shocked, because if they hadn't missed, you'd be dead, and you wouldn't be here to be surprised. But of course, that's an absurd proposition. You're surprised not only that you're alive, you're surprised that they missed. So the point is that it's, whether we're here to observe it or not, it's extremely unlikely that a life-sustaining universe would ever come about. And the fact that we're here to observe it doesn't explain why it happened at all. It's just this impossible event. And sure, yeah, we're here to appreciate it, but the fact that we're here to appreciate it doesn't explain why this absurd thing happened. Going back to the firing squad analogy, you would have to conclude that they missed on purpose, right? And it wasn't just random. And a person who just says, well, there's nothing to explain here. You're alive. That explains why they missed. And it's like, no, it doesn't. That's a whole different argument. Okay, and lastly, we have the intelligibility argument. This one is both old and new. This one is actually St. Thomas Aquinas' I think fifth way, kind of reformulated using some more modern verbs. But a person could say, the universe is describable through science and natural laws. No God is required to make the universe work, so where is the evidence of your God? To which Thomas Aquinas basically says, actually I'm going to draw a bad analogy. Prepare yourself for a bad analogy. I was talking to a Baptist friend of mine, and I was explaining to him Catholic tradition. He understands what Scripture is. He's like, well, what about the tradition? Like, what is this tradition that you speak of? When I read St. Augustine, he's always talking about Scripture. He's writing commentaries on Scripture, but he's never writing commentaries on the tradition. And I'm like, all right, get out your commentary written by St. Thomas Aquinas. Get it out. He's like, okay, I've got it out. I'm like, you are now looking at the tradition. The tradition is the commentary. If you're looking for Augustine to comment on the tradition, you're staring at the very thing that you're looking for, and you're not recognizing it. So a person who says, well, the universe works according to laws. Where's the evidence for God? Well, to that, St. Thomas Aquinas says this. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see things that lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, acting for an end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it is directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as an arrow is shot to its mark by an archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists, by whom all things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Now, if that seems a little obscure, we're going to fast forward to the modern age, and we're going to read something by, actually, I believe he was an atheist, but he was a mathematician by the name of Eugene Wigner. And he wrote an essay called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. And that article was about how incredible it is that we can form natural scientific laws at all. Why is it that the universe is describable with something as abstract as mathematics? That we can fit the world in our head using this obscure philosophy known as mathematics? Because mathematics is just a primitive form of philosophy. He said, the property of the regularity is a property without which physics would not be possible. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither which we neither understand nor deserve. And so what he's noticing there is that, geez, how weird is it that we inhabit a universe which can even be described by mathematical laws? Why would it be the case that we can reduce the workings of the universe to something mathematical? Mathematics is just something that we do in our heads. Why should we ever expect it to be also describing a thing out in the world? This is remarked upon by Pope Benedict XVI, who said, the universal intelligibility of nature, which is the presupposition of all science, can only be explained through recourse to an infinite and creative mind which has thought the world into being. No scientist could even begin to work unless and until he assumed that the aspect of nature that he was investigating was knowable and intelligible. But this fundamental mystical assumption rests upon the conviction that whatever he comes to know through his scientific work is simply an act of rethinking or recognizing what a far greater mind has already conceived. And so the essence of this argument is to say, to respond to the atheist who says, the world is governed by natural laws, it doesn't need God. The response is to say, well, why do we live in an ordered universe which is describable and understandable by human minds anyways? That's really neat. And so, to put it in the form of premises, it would be premise 1, the universe is imbued with rationality, which is basically the foundation of all the physical sciences. Premise 2, rationality is the product of a mind. Therefore, the creator of the universe is a rational mind. And so with that, we're going to now combine all 4 of these arguments that we've done tonight. We have a timeless, immaterial, powerful creator of the universe, which designed the universe with the intention of life, which exists through its own necessity, and imbues creation with its rationality. And so, in the words of Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above shows his handiwork. Day unto day it utters speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard.